Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight is the series Occult'n'Crochet, where I introduce a member from either the spiritual, religious, or occult community and show off, talk about a project either I'm working on or just completed. Those of you who've been checking in for the past several weeks would know that I'm working on a very specific shawl. It's made out of merino wool, and it started off in that department. We moved over into this more mid-color out to the reds, which is a very vibrant blood-colored red. It's really an intense color. It's not super big, but it's nice for, wrapping around your neck just to stay warm with. And as I said, it is made with merino wool, so it's very soft, hand wash only. So that is going to be up on my website hopefully in the next couple of days. Depends on what my schedule looks like with my day job, because you gotta have one of those in today's world to be able to do other things. So that will be going up on the site, like I said, sometime this week. I won't make a promises to a date. And I also have another project. It's not crochet, but it's with one of my organs that I've been working on that should be going live around the same time. So check over on the website probably Friday, Saturday, and just see what's new over there. With that, we'll hop into the occult aspect of our show, and I want to introduce you to a rather mysterious lady from Wicca. You could consider her a side or supporting character, but there's a lot more to her. Not a lot, because she kept very private about things, but her position within Wicca and witchcraft, especially the Gerald Gardner's time period, that I think needs to be brought to light just for the simple fact of she was that influential, but she was also that unknown. And her name is Edith Rose Woodford-Grimes. And we'll find out why she has such a long name. Edith came bouncing into this world in December of 1887. On the 18th of December, she would be born Edith Rose Ray to Father William Henry Ray, who was a former, I'm not sure what that exactly means, at the local waterworks. I'm assuming that that would be like a maintenance guy, someone who built parts of the machinery. But when you look up some of these terms, it's using modern day terms, not 1887 terms. Makes it a little more difficult. Her mother was Caroline Harrison Ray, and from what little I could find rooting around on the internet, her mother looks like she was a stay-at-home mom, maybe a teacher, a part-time teacher, but for the most part it was just stay-at-home mom type. Edith was born and raised in Malton, Yorkshire in England, and she had a really unassuming life. I dug around for a while because I wanted to know a little bit more about this person, and literally almost every single thing I ran across had almost an identical reference. Each place had a little tidbit that made them unique, but for the most part it was just the basics, straight up. She was born, fill in the blank, college. That was it. So she did go through school, she did go through some higher learning, some college level stuff, and became a teacher. It appears that she would be a teacher of English, drama, and music. Really about creation in her life, and it's interesting when you pick those three, because English, drama, and music are in reality one of the three of the better ways to, or language, English, whatever, but you can express life through those. You can create, but it's not just creating, you help bring people into your world with that type of work. So those were pretty interesting considering where she ends up later. Edith was very good at her job because she would become an associate, at London's College of Music, and if that's not enough, you working for one college, she also became an associate at London's Academy of Music. That's pretty impressive because she had 2 jobs, which it means she could have been teaching 1 class a week each. But the fact that she still was employed in 2 fairly large university college level music courses is to me kind of impressive. I love people who can play instruments. I am not good with instruments, much to the chagrin of my mother, who put me through like 8 years of piano lessons. Yeah, not so great. It did help me with other aspects of my life, but piano and musical instruments, not so much. It was in this line of work where Edith would meet Samuel William Woodford-Grimes. I have to say there's a penchant back in the day for these exceptionally long names, and this one's no exception. Samuel was born in 1880 in Bangalore, India, and he was working at the War Pensions office in Southampton when they met. They would marry shortly thereafter in June of 1920. And yep, back to my kombucha. This one is Island Bliss by Synergy. Not sponsored. Very good drinks though. Sorry. Edith would take his last name of Grimes when they married. Of course she would. And later would add one of his middle names as well, which was the Woodford. There are some theories out there as to why she would take on a middle name and a last name. And there are some people who say that it was a way to gain prestige or elegance, which, the bigger the name, especially in that time period, it did lead to the fact that you may have had a bigger lineage and came into money or something. There were other people who thought it was a form of snobbery because she could afford to have a second name. Honestly, I think that she just did it because it was a way to gain a little bit more respect, like the prestige aspect. The snobbery was referenced by one person, and it was their opinion that she did it to basically thumb her nose at people around her. Not the best way to look at things, but I wasn't there. This other person wasn't there. We're all just assuming at this point. So, the happy couple would take up residence in Postwood suburb of Southampton. In June of 1921, Edith and Samuel would welcome their first and their only child, a daughter named Roseanne. Not much is said about these mid-years, 1921 to 1924, probably because, babies, diapers, breastfeeding, babies, diapers, laundry, feeding, diapers, laundry, feeding, just continuing that path for 2 to 3 years, so that kind of fits. But Edith in 1924 would return to the workforce. And this time she chose to work as a tutor of English and dramatic literature. And I'm personally thinking that she did this because now I have a child who can't go to school yet. I need something that I can work around, and this is a great way to do that. Excuse me. It would be her primary job for many years to come, tutoring, especially in English and dramatic literature. She would eventually add elocution to her repertoire, and I had to look that word up because it sounded familiar, but there's certain things, like I said, the past few weeks have been interesting in my world. But it basically means that she would teach them the proper way to use grammar and to speak properly, clearly, and eloquently. So it was finishing school for your words, which, considering how people talk today in some instances, probably not a bad thing to bring that back. Edith would also begin teaching evening classes at Southampton Education Authority. Busy, and just so we're all clear, she's a wife and a mother with tutoring and night classes. That's a lot of work in and of itself. Each one of those is a full-time job. Wife, mother, those are full-time jobs, plus the extra work on top of it. Definitely wanted to be busy. But the wife part, where did my mouse go? I am having issues with my mouse right now, sorry. The mouse part, or mouse, the wife part would eventually fade into obscurity because Samuel and Edith separated. They wouldn't divorce because at that time it was very difficult to get a divorce, and judging by the way people talk about her today, there was so much shame and humiliation that would be brought on her by getting a divorce, him and her both, that it just wasn't worth the paperwork and wasn't worth the drama. It was easier to say, oh, he's living in excuse me, he's living in Southampton because of work, and I'm living over here because of work. It just works better for us this way. And that's pretty much what happened for them. In 1938, Edith would leave Southampton and move to Christchurch in Hampshire. I'm not from Britain, I do apologize. Edith would purchase a bungalow and set up shop as a private teacher there. She still taught drama primarily and elocution, ways to present yourself and communicate properly, clearly, etc. And now we have magic incoming, because this is where things bring her into the reason I am talking about her today. It was in this town, Christchurch, where Edith would find out about the Rosicrucian Order of Crotona Fellowship. Why they can't make these things a little bit simpler, I don't know, but this was a group of Rosicrucians that was founded in 1924, and it was an exceptionally baby group because it was only like 12 or 13 years old when Edith found out about it. It may have been a bit older. There's a little bit of intrigue around them, going back to as early as 1910, but it was under another name, and there's not a direct lineage to this point. It was hived off of another Rosicrucian group, but that's not so important to what we're talking about today. This group, the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship, liked to perform mystically themed plays and dramas in the local theater. Well, that's probably how Edith met them. And it's not just probable, it actually is. Over a short period of time, she would very much tie into the philosophies and practices of the group. Edith would go so far as to perform a role in the play that the group put on about Pythagoras. And she was the wife of the main character Pythagoras, and her name in character was Theano. And she also would use that name to name her house and property, the Theano House. And I have to say that is really cool because, side note here, I love the fact that you can naming your homes is a thing. We all talk about our cars and pets and things, but naming your house, that's cool to me. Whether you're dealing with an estate or just a basic apartment, naming the residence is such an odd but cool thing. I don't know. I'm a little weird. And I've always, just a thought, can you name your rentals too? Just tossing it out there. Anyway, back to Edith. It was thought that since the Rosicrucian group had some connections with Gerald Gardner, and this is how Edith came into contact with the New Forest clan, or coven. And that coven is the group that Gerald Gardner was apparently initiated into and eventually took over and hived off from. So when we're looking at the big picture here, Edith taught drama and English and elocution. So she would probably have met a young thespian who was trying to get into theater, who just happened to be part of this Rosicrucian group, and eventually would invite her in. This is purely conjecture on my part, but as I was going through it, this is kind of how it played out in my head. And as she was working with this group, getting to know them better, acting in their plays, she would run across or hear about this eccentric English gentleman by the name of Gerald Gardner, who didn't like to wear clothes and practiced witchcraft. So or at least was in the study of at that point, because it was still in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s, so it hadn't fully developed into what it became later. So that's kind of how I see it happening. Is she started training somebody, they invited her in, she was like, OMG, this is my life, and down the road we go. So there's a lot of theories about this particular coven, the New Forest Coven. But this group set up and promoted the new religion today that we would call Wicca. Back at that time, they still called it witchcraft, because I'm pretty sure that Gerald was just looking for shock value, to be honest with you. But there is a book I linked in the description that is In Search of the New Forest Coven, and it kind of goes over the history of what we can find out about the coven, because it was very, if Gerald is to be believed, it was very secretive and not many people outside knew about it, so it was all word of mouth with minor exceptions. So your guess is as good as mine as to how accurate everything is there. And to be perfectly honest with you, sorry, I lost my place on my notes. It doesn't really matter if you believe Gerald Gardner's story about this thing being several hundred, if not 1,000 years old. It was the witch cults and the secret societies tied into it, like Margaret Murray would talk about. Or if you think that he picked and chose from various esoteric groups, including the Golden Dawn, to develop his own lineage. Either way, we have Wicca today, so it kind of doesn't matter, and it's a very valid, viable religious practice, spiritual practice, sorry. There was a lot going on behind the scenes. While Edith was moving, gaining students, and joining a Rosicrucian type group, not officially joining, but being involved with, Edith's daughter, you remember Roseanne from a few minutes ago, she was growing up herself, and she would get married to, I believe it was a dentist, and Edith decided to let them move into her house, the Theano house, and when they moved in, Edith took the opportunity to move to Avenue College in Walkford. And guess what's so special about Walkford? Walkford is the next town over from Highcliffe. And Highcliffe is where Gerald Gardner and his wife Donna resided. So she basically moved closer to the people that could help her, or she could help them with this spiritual practice. And it came out many years later, as in the 80s, 90s, that Edith's coven name had been linked to Gerald Gardner from day one. Literally, from day one. This particular coven name was Dafo. D-A-F-O, which is referenced in almost every book that Gardner wrote. He references this mysterious woman. Never puts a name to her outside of Dafo. She was talked about on and off through Doreen Valiente. Alex Sanders references her, although his biographer misspelled the name and put D-A-F-F-O. Whatever, same name. But Dafo, we find out years later, was Edith's name, and he was referencing Edith that entire time. So her importance to the modern practice of witchcraft and Wicca is actually a lot more important than you would have thought to begin with. It was under the name Dafo that Edith would help found and be a member of the Bricketwood Coven, which is the coven that hived off of the New Forest Coven, that Gerald Gardner himself hived off and started to expand through that. And it appears that she would join in the early 1940s after, lore has it, she initiated Gerald Gardner into the coven himself, which would mean that she had previous rite of passage to be able to initiate him. So there's that. But as Gardner gained a public following and the media of that time, of course, that would really started getting curious about the membership within the coven, Defoe, Edith, left the coven in 1952. She did not want public recognition. She did not want all of the public notoriety that would go with it. Because Gardner didn't in the first part of his life. If you check out the video I've done on him before, he was not big on the publicity. It was later in his life, around this time period, where suddenly he started really courting it, because that was how he expanded the coven. That's how people really started finding out that witchcraft wasn't some old hag over a cauldron cursing people, but it was a nature-based spiritual practice that was very much about healing, health, spiritual development, and growth. There was still a lot of nudity involved, but that was more of Gardner's addition to the thing, as I said, if you check that out. Even in that time, and this is part of the reason that Edith didn't want all of this notoriety, anything outside of the approved religions, and in this area it would have been the Catholics and the Anglicans, could lead to very rough and harsh criticism from a very large group of people, even to the point of losing housing, losing your job. Edith had some real fears about being outed. She had separated from her husband. She was living on her own. Being outed as a witch would have destroyed everything that she had built. So she was more about, you know what, I'll just keep this part of my life quiet. They don't need to know, which is understandable. Personal experience, I kept my spiritual life and my spiritual practices pretty much away from everybody until I was in my mid-30s. So I get where she's coming from. Mid-30s, I'm like, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. Different time, though. These people are what has allowed us today to be as open about our spiritual practices as we are. So giving them homage and remembering them, which is a form of immortality, is a good way to show the respect to the older generations. Edith would not give up her spiritual path even though she'd left the coven. Later in 1952, she left, I think it was said that she left in the spring, but later in the year, fall-ish era, Gerald Gardner would bring Doreen Valiente, another one I talked about, to meet and visit with the mysterious Defoe, Edith. And they would meet several times over the next couple of years, even going so far as to visit Stonehenge during the midsummer rituals to witness the Druids' specific midsummer rites. It was said that Defoe, Edith, would remain very close friends with Gerald Gardner, and by extension, Donna and Doreen, for the rest of their lives. That's kind of a powerful connection, especially when you're meeting in that type of an environment. It's impressive. Honestly, just considering who those people are in our spiritual history, it would have been so amazing to have been able to be there with them, witnessing those particular rites, because at that time, it was a lot more secretive, but to me, a lot more authentic, because you couldn't do a lot of this stuff very publicly. I mean, it was public, but not like some of the pomp and circumstance that you'll see today at some of these rituals. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just I like the old school stuff better. I have an old soul, apparently. Times were never great for our dear friend Edith here, and eventually she would have to move in with her niece in 1954. This was a horrible situation, it would seem. At least from what I could find, it did not look pleasant. Edith's niece was a staunch, very strict Christian. And by definition, that would mean that she was against everything occult, magic, witchcraft, or outside the norms of my prescribed church. Okay. But poor Edith had to keep her head down and her mouth shut because kind of needed a place to live. Even when she would receive contact from various groups of witches seeking proof of Gardner's claims, justification of his lineages, or fill in the blank, she would just ignore these messages. There were 3 times that are referenced very specifically in 1958. Edith only responded to one of the 3 because she referenced these other 2 and were like, I'm not even responding to these people for whatever reason. And the 3rd, she would only say that she was interested in the philosophical aspects of witchcraft and the Rosicrucians, not the practices itself, and basically leave me alone politely. So, personal opinion here, I'm guessing that she finally responded in that 3rd message, because it kind of seems like it was the last one that she'd get for a while, that she probably was being monitored to a certain extent because she was friends with Gerald Gardner, and you can't keep that too quiet, but it was enough to keep him at a distance type thing. But she probably was having to keep things quiet, considering she was living with her niece. And you never know if the niece just happened to be nosy, possibly reading letters, asking so who was visiting, why did they show up here, whatever it was. There was probably a good reason for her to kind of like, I need to quiet this down quick. So that's where that ended up. And as I said earlier, it would be many years after her passing. One reference said multiple decades. She died in 75 and they figured it out by 95, so 2 decades, I guess you could say. Who this mysterious figure of Defoe was in real life. What I thought was interesting as I was poking around is how many of the witch historians actually knew who she was, but didn't want it to be made public out of respect for Edith, because she had tried so hard to keep who she was a secret. Truth eventually comes out, as it always does, but I thought it was fascinating as I was poking around, and I just kept running across so-and-so, biographer of so-and-so, actually knew who Defoe was at the time of writing their book, but they did not want to out Edith. I'm like, she'd been passed already. That's shocking. But I think it was the fact that Edith, out of respect to her, they just didn't want to go there. So, and that's why I say, knowing a little bit more about our history, whether it's spiritual, Wicca, witchcraft, pick a religion, because I am going to get into some of those guys too. Knowing your history, what your roots are, why some things had to happen to be able to do, be, and say what we have today, it's good to know and pay respects back to them. Their sacrifices, their hard work are why we have what we have today in the spiritual and religious communities. So it's out of respect that I bring up who she was and how she fit into this whole thing, because it was a little interesting over the years. But this is, not always a happy story here. Edith would eventually pass from this world in 1975. She passed in quiet obscurity. Not much is known as to if it was old age, if it was a medical condition. She was a very private woman even to the end, and not much is said about her. But she is not forgotten by any stretch today. Edith is seen as one of the very first adherents of witchcraft in the modern world. She stayed very quiet about her practice, to be silent, throughout her entire life, only being known publicly, quote unquote, as Defoe. Her involvement was referenced a lot by the name Defoe. Along with this line of thought and the reference to Defoe, Gerald Gardner himself would claim that it was Defoe, Edith, that actually had introduced him to the New Forest clan. And it was Defoe that introduced him to witchcraft. And going through this thread of thought, it was Defoe that would initiate Gerald Gardner into the New Forest clan. And when you read Witchcraft Today by Gerald Gardner, and you read some of the other works and articles that he had published, when he references Defoe, he always calls her the witch. Basically, like she was the first, the one. Which puts a little different spin on what we think about her as an obscure figure tied to Gerald Gardner. Did she help create Gerald Gardner in the path that we know him in today? Edith would be memorialized in Wicca by Francis Cameron when an essay was performed from the point of view of Edith in the Wicca community. The prose was called Defoe's Tale, and it was performed at the Charge of the Goddess conference in 2010. I tried to find some YouTube link or something I could link in the description so you could go check it out. I couldn't find anything, so I do apologize for that. But it was interesting because not a lot is known. Like I said, this is what I could find, and I dug around a lot to find this. Not a lot is known about Defoe, Edith, but it is interesting how her lore and legend is pretty massive. We just didn't have a birth name to go with her through this whole situation. So if you've ever read Gerald Gardner's Witchcraft Today or heard of Edith Woodford-Grimes, or been associated with any of these groups that have talked about her, let me know in the comments down below, because I'm curious a lot about this particular character in our spiritual history, because she's just she pops up randomly and then disappears, and for the longest time no one would say who she was. And then as it finally came out, then it was like, wait a minute, Gerald talked about her as if she was the most important thing to his line of Wicca or witchcraft, the Gardenian line. And in a lot of people's mindsets and thoughts as they've talked about it, it would appear that she may have been the one who brought him into this particular vein of thought. And when he hived off and made the new Bricketwood Coven, sorry, she would step away because he was getting very much into publicity at that point. So, and being as secretive as she was, we could think that maybe there might be more to her than meets the eye, and she didn't meet the Rosicrucian group in Christ Church by accident. Could have been planned. You never know. A lot of theories and a lot of conjectures, because she didn't talk a lot about what she did, and she kept very quiet about it. So, with that, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video if you enjoy this type of content. And like I said, comment down below if you've ever heard of Edith or of Defoe, how you heard of her, maybe reference type thing, and what are your thoughts? Do you think she was a lot more influential than what meets the eye, or do you think she just happened to be a random person who got tied up with someone who helped develop the coven that we know today? So with that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your week. If you are in the United States, have a happy 4th of July, which is coming up in 3 days, and I will see you in the next video.